The sounds of explosions filled the air as Captain Kane's ship tore through the skies above an alien planet. His heart raced as his hands gripped the control panel, struggling to keep the damaged ship on course. His squadron, once a force to be reckoned with, had been wiped out in minutes. The alien fleet was overwhelming, their weapons far more advanced than anything humanity had. They came without warning. And now, Kane was alone. The battlefield was chaotic, the stars above flickering as laser fire streaked through space. His ship, battered and broken, was on the edge of a crash. The final transmission from his commanding officer echoed in his mind. "Make sure humanity has a future." Those words, meant to inspire, now felt like a cruel reminder of the hopelessness of the situation. With a violent jerk, the ship plummeted toward the surface of the planet. The emergency systems kicked in, but they were no match for the destruction. As the ship descended, Kane's thoughts turned to his crew. His friends, the men and women who had fought beside him, now lost forever. He clenched his fists, not in fear, but in anger. He wouldn't let their sacrifice be in vain. They may have lost the battle, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The ground below seemed to rush up to meet him, and with a deafening crash, the ship hit the surface. The force of the impact sent Kane flying out of his seat, slamming into the control panel. Pain shot through his body as he struggled to regain his bearings. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing: survival. Outside, the alien planet's landscape was stark and hostile. Jagged rocks and twisted metal scattered across the desolate terrain, remnants of past battles. Kane knew he had to move. The aliens wouldn't give him time to recover. They would be hunting him down soon. He grabbed his weapon, checked his supplies, and stumbled out of the wreckage, doing his best to ignore the pain. As he crept through the ruins, he could hear the faint hum of alien drones in the distance. His heart pounded as his every step brought him closer to the inevitable confrontation. He was injured, alone, and outnumbered. But Kane had survived worse. The thought of his people's future fueled him, pushing him forward. Then, just as he thought he was alone in this hostile world, a shadow fell over him. Kane froze. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure emerging from the smoke and debris. At first, he thought it might be one of his own, maybe a fellow soldier who had somehow survived. But the figure was unlike anything he'd ever seen. A woman, tall and imposing, with skin that glowed a faint blue under the planet's strange light. Her eyes, glowing with a fierce intelligence, fixed on him. She was an alien, one of the hunters sent to eliminate him. Kane's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. Unlike his fellow soldiers, who had shown fear in the face of death, Kane had learned long ago to embrace it. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. This alien woman was a predator, but so was he in his own way. He wasn't afraid. He had nothing left to lose. The woman studied him with curiosity, her gaze intense. She tilted her head, seemingly surprised. "Why aren't you afraid, human?" she asked in a voice that was both commanding and curious. Kane didn't answer right away. He knew fear. He had felt it when he lost his family, when his world crumbled around him. But fear didn't have a place in his heart anymore. He had seen too much death, too much destruction. Fear wouldn't help him survive. His thoughts were on the future, on the survival of his species, not on the fearsome alien before him. She took a step closer, her eyes scanning him with an almost clinical interest. She was an apex predator, a member of a race that had crushed civilizations and conquered planets for centuries. To her, humans were little more than insects. Yet here he was, standing before her, refusing to show the fear that she was used to seeing in her prey. "I've killed countless humans," she continued, her voice almost a whisper now. "But you are different." Her words were full of disbelief, and for the first time, Kane felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was something more to his survival than just being a soldier. Maybe humanity had more to offer than just weapons and tactics. Kane didn't lower his weapon. He didn't move. He simply locked eyes with the alien, his expression unwavering. "You haven't killed me yet," he said, his voice steady, without a hint of fear. The alien woman seemed to pause, processing his words. She looked around, as if assessing the situation. He was clearly injured, vulnerable. Her instincts told her to kill him now, before he became a threat. But something about him, something in his defiant stance, made her hesitate. "I've seen fear in the eyes of every human I've encountered," she said slowly, almost to herself. "Why not you?" Kane's answer was simple, but it was the only one that mattered in that moment. "Because I fight for more than just myself. I fight for my people, for humanity, and that's why I'll never be afraid." The alien woman's eyes narrowed, but this time she didn't attack. Instead, she took another step back, studying him with a newfound respect. Kane wasn't sure if he had won her over, or if she was simply intrigued by his defiance. Either way, this moment would be the turning point. She stepped into the shadows, disappearing from view. Kane stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew this. The fight wasn't over. He had just encountered an alien who had underestimated the human spirit. And now, it was his turn to show her that humans weren't to be taken lightly. As he moved forward, the wind howled across the desolate landscape. Kane couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. The aliens had made a mistake by underestimating him and humanity. They would soon learn that no matter how powerful they were, they would never break the will of a human soldier. Kane's eyes darted around the wreckage of his ship, still feeling the adrenaline surge through him. The alien woman hadn't killed him. She hadn't even moved to strike. Instead, she stood there, her glowing blue skin casting an eerie light over the broken landscape, staring at him as if she were trying to figure out something about him. The faint hum of alien technology echoed in the distance, but for the moment, everything around him felt eerily silent. The alien didn't speak for a while, and Kane took a moment to catch his breath. His body was bruised, bloodied, and his muscles screamed for rest. But he couldn't afford to rest. Not now. He kept his weapon steady, his finger lightly on the trigger, but it was clear that the woman wasn't acting like an enemy. At least, not in the way he expected. Her piercing eyes never left him, her gaze calculating and cold. It was as though she was weighing every action he took. Kane didn't flinch. He knew how dangerous she could be, and that made him even more cautious. He didn't know whether she was going to kill him now or ask him to fight for her amusement. Either way, he had to be ready. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice low and commanding. "You should be afraid, human. I am the one who has brought down entire fleets. I have seen fear in the eyes of every human I've killed. And yet, you stand before me unafraid." Kane didn't flinch at her words. He'd heard the same kind of taunts from his enemies before. It was all part of the war, part of the mind games they played. But this time, it felt different. This alien woman wasn't just speaking to taunt him. There was genuine curiosity in her voice, as though she had encountered something unexpected, something she didn't understand. She wanted to know why he wasn't afraid, and he was going to make sure she found out. "Maybe you've never met a human like me before," Kane said, his voice steady, but with a hint of defiance. "Maybe we're not all the same. Maybe we're not all afraid of death." Her eyes narrowed as she slowly took a step forward. The alien's presence was overwhelming, like a predator closing in on its prey. But Kane didn't step back. He held his ground. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just a physical battle. This was a mental one, too. She wanted to break him, wanted him to show fear, but Kane wouldn't give her that satisfaction. "I've fought against beings far stronger than you," Kane continued, his voice growing louder. "I've seen entire planets destroyed. I've lost everything. But I'm still here, and I'm still fighting. You can kill me, or you can learn what makes us human, but I'm not afraid of you." The alien woman paused. For a moment, Kane thought he had miscalculated. Maybe he had pushed her too far. Maybe she was going to kill him now, to prove her superiority. But instead, she simply tilted her head, as if considering his words. There was something about her expression, something new in her gaze. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the hunger of a predator. It was interest. She was intrigued. "You speak as if you have nothing left to lose," she said, her voice softer now, "as if death no longer holds any power over you." Cain met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "That's right. I've lost everything. But that's what makes me dangerous. I have nothing to fear. I'll keep fighting, no matter what." The alien woman stepped closer, her movements graceful and deliberate. She was close enough now that Cain could see every detail of her face, her sharp features, the intricate patterns of light on her skin, and the intensity in her eyes. It was as though she was studying him, trying to understand what made him tick. He could sense her curiosity, her fascination with him. This wasn't just about a hunt anymore. This was a test. She was trying to figure out why this human, this soldier, wasn't like the others she had encountered. Without warning, she reached out and touched his shoulder, her fingers cold and smooth. Cain stiffened at the touch, but he didn't pull away. He was used to being in dangerous situations, but this felt different. The alien's touch didn't feel like the strike of a weapon. It felt like the stroke of someone trying to understand him. "You're not afraid of death," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I wonder, are you afraid of failure? Of losing everything again?" Cain's heart skipped a beat. Her words cut deep. The thought of failure, of losing everything again, was something he had tried to push away. But now, facing this alien woman, it was impossible to ignore. He had already lost so much. His family, his friends, his comrades. The idea of failing them again was more terrifying than any alien or weapon could be. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not afraid of failure. I'm afraid of not trying. I'm afraid of letting my people down." The alien woman's eyes glinted, as if she found some sort of answer in his words. She stepped back, her expression thoughtful. "You fight for something greater than yourself," she said, almost as if to herself. "You're kind. You are different." Cain didn't know if that was a compliment or an insult, but he didn't care. All he knew was that she hadn't killed him yet. In fact, she was almost studying him, as if he was part of some strange puzzle she needed to solve. He didn't know what her next move would be, but he was ready for anything. If it came to a fight, he would fight. If it came to diplomacy, he would negotiate. But one thing was certain: he wouldn't let her break him. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time, Cain felt like he might have gained some respect from this alien woman. Maybe even a hint of admiration. Whatever the case, he knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She was testing him. But he wasn't about to fail. Not now. Not ever. The sun hung low over the alien planet, casting a strange red glow on the jagged landscape. Cain stood in the wreckage of his ship, his body still aching from the crash. But his mind was sharp. The alien woman, who had once seemed like his inevitable end, now seemed less like an enemy and more like something else, something different. He didn't trust her completely, but something about this situation had changed. She wasn't hunting him. Not now, at least. Her name, he learned, was Veshka. She had no reason to trust him either, yet here they were, both standing in a war zone, staring at each other like two sides of a coin. One human, one alien. But the words she had spoken earlier were still echoing in his mind. "You are different," she had said. Her voice wasn't filled with the malice or arrogance he had expected. It was filled with curiosity, a hint of something deeper, something more complex. The alien woman paused. For a moment, Cain thought he had miscalculated. Maybe he had pushed her too far. Maybe she was going to kill him now, to prove her superiority. But instead, she simply tilted her head, as if considering his words. There was something about her expression, something new in her gaze. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the hunger of a predator. It was interest. She was intrigued. "You speak as if you have nothing left to lose," she said, her voice softer now, "as if death no longer holds any power over you." Cain met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "That's right. I've lost everything. But that's what makes me dangerous. I have nothing to fear. I'll keep fighting, no matter what." The alien woman stepped closer, her movements graceful and deliberate. She was close enough now that Cain could see every detail of her face, her sharp features, the intricate patterns of light on her skin, and the intensity in her eyes. It was as though she was studying him, trying to understand what made him tick. He could sense her curiosity, her fascination with him. This wasn't just about a hunt anymore. This was a test. She was trying to figure out why this human, this soldier, wasn't like the others she had encountered. Without warning, she reached out and touched his shoulder, her fingers cold and smooth. Cain stiffened at the touch, but he didn't pull away. He was used to being in dangerous situations, but this felt different. The alien's touch didn't feel like the strike of a weapon. It felt like the stroke of someone trying to understand him. "You're not afraid of death," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I wonder, are you afraid of failure? Of losing everything again?" Cain's heart skipped a beat. Her words cut deep. The thought of failure, of losing everything again, was something he had tried to push away. But now, facing this alien woman, it was impossible to ignore. He had already lost so much. His family, his friends, his comrades. The idea of failing them again was more terrifying than any alien or weapon could be. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not afraid of failure. I'm afraid of not trying. I'm afraid of letting my people down." The alien woman's eyes glinted, as if she found some sort of answer in his words. She stepped back, her expression thoughtful. "You fight for something greater than yourself," she said, almost as if to herself. "Your kind. You are different." Cain didn't know if that was a compliment or an insult, but he didn't care. All he knew was that she hadn't killed him yet. In fact, she was almost studying him, as if he was part of some strange puzzle she needed to solve. He didn't know what her next move would be, but he was ready for anything. If it came to a fight, he would fight. If it came to diplomacy, he would negotiate. But one thing was certain: he wouldn't let her break him. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time, Cain felt like he might have gained some respect from this alien woman. Maybe even a hint of admiration. Whatever the case, he knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She was testing him. But he wasn't about to fail. Not now. Not ever. The sun hung low over the alien planet, casting a strange red glow on the jagged landscape. Cain stood in the wreckage of his ship, his body still aching from the crash. But his mind was sharp. The alien woman, who had once seemed like his inevitable end, now seemed less like an enemy and more like something else, something different. He didn't trust her completely, but something about this situation had changed. She wasn't hunting him. Not now, at least. Her name, he learned, was Veshka. She had no reason to trust him either, yet here they were, both standing in a war zone, staring at each other like two sides of a coin. One human, one alien. But the words she had spoken earlier were still echoing in his mind. "You are different," she had said. Her voice wasn't filled with the malice or arrogance he had expected. It was filled with curiosity, a hint of something deeper, something more complex. "You can't be serious," Cain said, taking a step back. "You want me to betray my own people, to fight for you, for your kind." Veshka didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to betray your people. I'm asking you to choose your survival. You don't have the luxury of refusing." The weight of her words hit Cain like a punch to the gut. He had come this far, fought tooth and nail to stay alive. And now, she was asking him to make an impossible choice. Could he really ally himself with the very people who had destroyed his home? The ones who had slaughtered his friends and comrades. The ones who had killed millions. "No," Cain said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "I'll never join you. I'd rather die." Veshka's expression didn't change. She was cold, calculating. "Then you leave me no choice." Before Cain could react, Veshka's hand shot out, and a sharp, searing pain tore through his side. He gasped, stumbling backward as the pain exploded in his body. His hand went to his side, and he felt the warmth of his blood seep through his fingers. He looked at her in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. She had stabbed him. She had betrayed him. "You?" Cain whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Veshka stood over him, her face expressionless. "I warned you, Cain. Survival is a choice. You chose the wrong path." The world around Cain started to blur as his vision faded. His heart pounded, and the blood continued to pour from the wound. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The pain was unbearable, and all he could do was fall to his knees. Veshka watched him silently, her cold gaze never leaving him. She didn't look like she regretted her decision. She had done what she believed was necessary for her survival. In her mind, he had become a liability, a threat to her mission. And in the cold logic of war, there was no room for weakness, no room for failure. Cain's breathing grew shallow as he collapsed to the ground. He could feel the darkness closing in, and for a moment, all he could think about was the friends he had lost, the life he had once known. He had fought so hard to survive, but now it felt like it was all slipping away. But then, just as his vision began to fade completely, he heard something. A faint voice. "Cain, Cain, stay with me." It was Veshka's voice. She sounded different now, softer, almost regretful. But it didn't matter. It was too late. The world went black. Cain felt nothing. He had lost everything. His fight, his trust, his life. All of it was gone. The betrayal had been complete. And now, Cain had paid the ultimate price. The pain was unbearable. Cain's entire body felt like it was on fire, the gash in his side seeping blood. He could hear the sound of his breath coming in shallow gasps, but everything else was a blur. He lay there, unable to move, his vision fading in and out. But in the chaos of pain and fear, something snapped inside him. He had fought too hard, survived too much, to just give up now. Cain's eyes fluttered open. His body felt weak, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't dead. Not yet. He could still fight. He could still make it out of here. The betrayal by Veshka stung like a knife to the heart, but in this moment, anger burned hotter than anything else. The rage surged through him, pushing away the weakness and the pain. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let his death be in vain. Through the haze of pain, he remembered the one thing that kept him going, the mission. He had a job to do. He had a purpose. He couldn't let this alien world defeat him, not after everything he had been through. His thoughts sharpened as he recalled the weapons in his pack, the medkits and the small explosives he had scavenged after the crash. He wasn't dead yet, not by a long shot. With a grunt, Cain managed to push himself up onto one knee, feeling the sharp pull in his side. His whole body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to stand. The ground felt unsteady beneath him, but he steadied himself. He couldn't waste any more time. Veshka had already gotten what she wanted, his weakness, but Cain wasn't about to let her have the last word. He wasn't about to let her be the one who decided his fate. His hand found the medkit in his pack, and he quickly opened it, fumbling with the contents as the world continued to spin. His hands were slick with blood, but he gritted his teeth and patched up the wound as best as he could. It wasn't enough to fully stop the bleeding, but it would buy him time. He had to be quick. Veshka might have abandoned him, but the war wasn't over. He wasn't going to give up, not without a fight. As he staggered forward, Cain could hear the low hum of the alien drones in the distance. They were getting closer. He could feel the urgency in every step, every second that passed. He had to move fast before they found him again. He couldn't let them capture him. He couldn't let them finish what Veshka had started. Kane's eyes scanned the terrain ahead. The landscape stretched out in all directions, an unforgiving desert, jagged mountains in the distance, and the cold, unforgiving sky above. But there, in the distance, he saw something. A figure. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. Veshka. She was standing in the middle of an open field, her posture stiff and proud. The glow from her weapon cast an eerie light, and Kane knew that if he didn't act soon, he would lose his chance. Despite the pain coursing through his body, Kane moved toward her, his footsteps steady but slow. Each step brought him closer to the woman who had once been his ally, the one who had turned on him when he refused to betray everything he believed in. He wasn't sure what her game was now, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. She might have stabbed him, but she hadn't finished him. Not yet. As he approached her, Veshka turned her head. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the air between them felt thick with tension. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched him, as though waiting for him to make the next move. Kane took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I thought you were done with me," he said, his voice raw but filled with resolve. Veshka's gaze softened, but only slightly. She didn't respond, just stood there, weapon in hand, as though measuring him up. The wind picked up, carrying dust and debris across the barren landscape. Kane's heart pounded in his chest as the silence stretched between them. And then, without warning, she spoke. "You should have joined me when you had the chance. You would have lived." Kane shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You're wrong. I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees." The words felt heavy in the air, hanging between them like a challenge. Veshka's expression didn't change, but Kane could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't just a cold-hearted soldier. She was a product of her environment, raised to believe that survival came above all else. But in this moment, it seemed like something in her was wavering. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you fight so hard for a cause that has no future?" Kane didn't hesitate. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I fight for what's worth fighting for. No matter the odds. No matter the cost." Veshka was silent for a long time, her gaze unwavering as she studied him. Kane knew he was bleeding out. That time was running short. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up, but he refused to give in. He refused to be defeated. "Then fight," she said suddenly, her voice sharp. "Show me what humans are made of." The challenge was clear in her words. There was no more hesitation. She raised her weapon, aiming it at him. Kane's heart raced as he took a deep breath, his fingers twitching towards the weapon at his side. He wasn't going to die without a fight. He wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not ever. The world seemed to slow as the two of them faced off in the middle of the open field. The distant hum of the alien drones was growing louder, but Kane didn't care. His focus was entirely on Veshka. He could feel the weight of every moment, every breath, building to this one final confrontation. Without warning, Kane charged. His legs screamed in protest, but his willpower carried him forward. Veshka's weapon fired, but he was already moving, diving to the side and rolling behind a large rock. He was close now. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, sharpening his senses, heightening his awareness. He was alive, and he wasn't going to let her take that away from him. Veshka moved, her steps swift and precise, but Kane was faster. He surged forward, using the terrain to his advantage. The sound of his breathing, the pounding of his heart, all merged into the single goal: survival. It wasn't just a fight for his life anymore. It was a fight for everything he had lost, for the people he had once known, for everything he would die for. The final stand had begun. The dust settled in the air, the silence following the chaos almost suffocating. Kane's breath was ragged, his body screaming from exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The battle was far from over. He stood tall, his eyes never leaving Veshka, who was just a few paces ahead, her weapon raised. But Cain could feel it in the air. The tide had shifted. The moment of truth had arrived. Veshka stood still for a moment, her gaze locked onto his. Her expression was unreadable, her stance rigid as if she were weighing her options, calculating her next move. Cain's heart beat loudly in his chest. His body ached from the wounds and exhaustion, but he had one thing on his side: the will to survive. It was all he had left now. "You've already lost," Cain said, his voice rough but strong. His fingers tightened around his weapon, the weapon that had brought him this far, the weapon that had kept him alive against impossible odds. He wasn't going to let this end in defeat. Veshka's lips tightened, her eyes narrowing as she considered his words. The wind picked up, howling across the barren landscape, but neither of them moved. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both. Veshka didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her weapon slightly, her gaze shifting to the horizon. Cain could see the inner conflict in her eyes, the hesitation in her stance. She was torn between what she had been taught, survival above all, and something else, something deeper. Cain used the moment of hesitation to his advantage. He wasn't about to let it slip away. With a quick movement, he launched himself forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Veshka's eyes widened, her instincts kicking in as she raised her weapon again. But this time, Cain was ready. He twisted to the side, using his momentum to knock her arm aside. The weapon fired, the blast missing him by inches as he took her down with a swift, well-placed strike. Veshka's body hit the ground with a heavy thud, her weapon skidding away into the dust. For a moment, Cain stood over her, panting, his body trembling with the effort. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. This was it. The battle had come down to this final moment. Veshka lay on the ground, her eyes still sharp, but there was a sense of defeat in her expression. She didn't move, didn't fight back. For the first time since he had met her, she seemed vulnerable, human even. "You're not like them," Cain said, his voice quieter now, softer than before. He could feel the weight of everything they had been through together. The lies, the betrayal, the struggle for survival. They had fought side by side, but now they were enemies. But even as he stood there, poised to end it, something inside him told him that this wasn't the end he wanted. Veshka looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. For the first time, there was no malice in her gaze, no judgment, just understanding. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice thick with regret. "I was just trying to survive." Cain's heart tightened at the words. She had been trained to think this way, raised to believe in a world where survival meant everything. She had been a soldier, a weapon, with no room for emotions, no space for doubt. But now, as they stood on the brink of destruction, she was human again. She wasn't just an alien soldier anymore. She was someone who had lost, just like him. Someone who had been broken by the world they lived in. Cain took a deep breath, his grip on his weapon loosening. He had come so far, fought so hard, but in this moment, he knew what had to be done. There was no victory in killing her, no glory in destroying her completely. He had come here to fight for his life, for the lives of those he loved. But now, it wasn't about the fight anymore. It was about what he could still save. "You can't keep fighting this war, Veshka," he said softly, his eyes steady on her. "There's more to life than just survival." Veshka's gaze flickered, and for a moment, Cain saw the weight of her years of conflict in her eyes. She had seen too much, had fought too long. She had been trapped in a system that didn't care for her or anyone like her. In this war, there were no winners, just survivors. And those survivors were often left with nothing but regret and pain. "I never had a choice," she said, her voice cracking. It was either join them or die. Cain felt a pang of sympathy for her, but he knew he couldn't let her win. Not like this. Not after everything. But he couldn't kill her either. not in cold blood. "I know," he whispered, "but it's over now. We both have a chance to make it right. We can walk away from this. Together." The words hung in the air between them. Veshka didn't move, but her eyes softened, the hardness in her expression melting away, replaced by something much more vulnerable. She had been defeated. But in that moment, Cain realized she wasn't his enemy anymore. She had been a victim of the same war that had taken everything from him. She was just trying to survive, just like him. Veshka looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for some sign of truth. And in that moment, Cain realized that he was offering her something no one had ever offered her before, a chance for redemption, a chance to let go of the hatred and the violence, to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Veshka slowly nodded. The tension between them melted away, and for the first time, Cain felt a sense of peace. They had both been broken, both had lost so much, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink, Cain extended a hand to Veshka. She hesitated, but then, with a soft sigh, she took it. There were no words left to say. They didn't need them. They both knew what came next.